So we can probably start. So I'd like to maybe just start on a quick introduction. And I want to say that at any point, do feel free to ask questions. I hope this is going to be sort of fairly informal and interactive conversation. And regarding the format of how I'd like to do the talk, this is more sort of an essay. So I'm a visual artist, therefore the focus is going to be really much on the visual content, and it will be a visual essay on some of my experiences. And of course, with everything that's going on in Ukraine, there is a lot of revisiting, a lot of rethinking of the past work and past lines of thought, past experiences. So my focus is going to be on the works that somehow resonate in slightly different light, possibly with what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in the world, because we're all touched by it, and on many levels. So my personal kind of family background, and if I may start on that, I think Larissa, I'm sure Larissa will join. I'd like to thank, first of all, everybody who's joined in, and Garrett for this amazing opportunity and amazing chance to speak to you all. And especially I have a very, very warm feelings towards Japan. I went to Japan in 2012 and completely fallen in love with culture and society.
You should have told us. You should have come to our dinners, like Vito does.
I'm waiting for the invitation. I would absolutely love that. So it's an incredibly beautiful, rich, and challenging place. Very stimulating. So thank you again, and konnichiwa. I think. So I'll start a little bit on my background. I've originally, I consider myself a Ukrainian and British artist. I started growing up in a Ukrainian city of Dnipro, or Dnipropetrovsk, what it used to be called. It's very much an industrial town with heavily Russian-speaking town, where in the sort of 70s, 80s, the emphasis was on all of the schools being Russian-speaking, with exceptions being made to teach Ukrainian language as a separate language alongside with English. And that's probably where both my English language first experience have started. My childhood in Dnipro didn't last very long. I was there with my whole family, aunts, uncles. And there was a challenging place. We used to live in old barracks built by German troops during the times of still do from the war times. And of course, there was no water, no facilities as such. So it was a very interesting start of the journey for me. But there was a lot of family and kind of a lot of interaction. And my father at the time, was working on his creative projects, developing his style. He was an artist, or he is an artist, and he very much deals with the problems of Ukrainian national identity as cultural identity. So he used to focus on depicting traditions, folk traditions, different references to the Cossack history, to Ukrainian history. Especially, he used also the style that was called Boychuk style, that relied on developing Malevich's sort of abstraction and the formal language that was started at the turn of the century and then taken further by Sterligov and Boychuk in Ukraine. So as you can imagine, that didn't sit very well with sort of Soviet propaganda. It didn't sit very well with main line of artistic endeavor. And very shortly, he started to get visits from KGB. I remember some of the KGB standing outside my school gate. It was kind of comedic in some way. It was 30 degrees heat, and everybody was in little dresses and t-shirts. And there were two people dressed fully in full grey suits, and it was very, very easy to spot. So there was no hiding it. And of course, there were friends of my father who were poets, writers, who were disappearing one by one to gulags. And at one point when I was 8, my father's turn have come to some of those meetings and interrogations. And in some way we were fortunate. He was given, because there was no language involved, it was very much a visual language. There were very difficult to pin down where there was a line between the nationalism, as it was called, and depicting a national folk traditions. So we were given a chance to escape to St. Petersburg, or to just leave the city. So the decision was taken by family to leave to St. Petersburg. We were given 1 week to get out, and that's how I ended up studying in St. Petersburg. Went to an art school there.
Just to think, can I ask you, I didn't quite catch this. By the way, Larissa is here now. She joined.
Okay, brilliant.
Yeah.
Yes, I can see. Thank you.
One thing I didn't quite catch, maybe you said it and I missed it. Why did you suddenly have to leave? You said your father's actions were not kind of specific enough to be deliberately prosecuted, but at the same time, you had only 1 week to leave. Can you explain a bit how that worked?
So he was called in several times into KGB and tried to persuade him to give up on working in his style, which was not in line with the Soviet and social realism.
His paintings.
And his paintings, yes, and then he had to
more red or something like that. Use more red or more red flags or something, or portraits of Lenin or something like this.
Pretty much. So it was too unfigurative. So it was too schematic, very much sort of Malevich. There was too many abstract elements, and above all, there was too many references to Ukrainian history. And that is something that obviously was not welcomed, was not, the idea was not to preserve, but to stylize a history and edit it in a manner that would work within the general line of what was sort of a Soviet empire. So it was at that point a big pressure to eliminate any reference to a unique culture, to a unique history. And that is the background where I've grown up. And I remember even at school, I was nearly thrown out of this school because when I was 7, because I corrected my Ukrainian language teacher, naive as I was. He used a word, a Russianized version word. And I've told him that, well, actually, there is a Ukrainian word for that specific term. And that was enough to call in my parents and say that, accuse them of being nationalist, because I was far too preoccupied with Ukrainian language as original language. So any form of attention or care for the culture, for the preservation of the culture, was cut out and eliminated systematically throughout that period. There was a format within which it was permissible to express your culture, and there was a very, very narrow band where you could sing particular songs usually glorifying either the workers or the peasants, happy songs, and in very, very stylized Ukrainian costumes. So there was a sort of a surface that seemed to present one picture of acceptance of the difference, yet in a very, very band of this larger kind of conveyor of this literally a huge Soviet conveyor of how the culture may be allowed to express themselves. So deep research into variations and differences in regional cultures, in regional songs, unique craft skills were eliminated. And I was very fortunate that my father was actually interested in those things. We traveled around Ukraine and collected songs, visited some little crafts villages where people used to produce unique Ukrainian instruments called bandura and kobza, which were, again, they were banned, and this village was closed down. They were no longer permitted to produce this Ukrainian national instrument because it would compete with balalaika, and somehow that was threatening. So that was very much a presence in my childhood. So when my father was called in several times by that point and was followed by the KGB, had a number of visits to his studio, the pressure had become really, really large, and there was a real danger of him being taken away to gulags. But because they couldn't pinpoint where exactly he made the nationalist statement, he infuriated this local KGB outpost to a degree where they really didn't know what else to do with him. They tried to force him to make false statements about things, and he was very lucky. He was very clever. I guess it was a combination where they've in the end just decided to give him an ultimatum and just get him out of their sight. So we had to take on the ultimatum option and move very quickly to St. Petersburg, because the next step literally would have been some kind of falsified a reason that could have taken him over to Gulag. And I remember a friend of my childhood, her father was already literally a few years before then taken. He was a poet, and he ended up dying in gulags in the labor camps. So it was very, very, very real presence throughout these years. So of course, St. Petersburg by that time in the 80s was a lot less preoccupied with Ukrainian nationalism. They weren't really bothered too much. In the 80s, it was starting to become a place of more liberal arts. To mention a little bit earlier my father's history again, he already had to move around Soviet Union a few times because he took part in the dissident exhibitions in the 70s. And the way to deal with those artists, there were several who perished, but in his case, his passport, which allowed him to have what's called prapiska, which is a residency permit in the city, was taken away, and then the residency permit would get taken away, and then you weren't allowed to stay in the city, and you had to either leave or move or find another job. So there was a lot of history already in the 70s, and when he came back to the St. Petersburg in the 80s, it was a lot more free society comparing to those things. There were some of the exhibitions of those nonconformist artists taking place. So we were able to join in that life, even though it was still very secretive, and there were groups of artists who were students of Malevich, was Sterligov group, who were meeting in secret and studying those formalist problems and resolving them in creative way. I was able to join them, sort of just come along with my parents to those groups. My mother was also an art historian, so it was very, very creative family. And given that I've already had probably been registered in KGB books as a sort of undesired social element, I didn't really have much choice other than to go down the artistic career. So I wouldn't have had any chance of joining Communist Party. So the path was sort of defined for me already by that point. And it was very interesting. It was fascinating to see some of those exhibitions, take part in those groups. And I remember as sort of childhood memories, those odd things you remember, like watching Star Wars under completely blanked out windows and doors because it was an illegal activity. And it was still a very very intense period if you wanted to explore anything beyond that sort of big empire sort of directives. So this is more or less a background that was formed my sort of original creative ideas. And I also went to the art school that was sort of called the secondary art school. So from age 11, you're allowed to apply to the art school that was founded by Catherine the Great, who set up an Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg. And following, she was trying to import the cultural formats from France. And the Academy of Arts was very, very much a copycat from what was happening in Paris. And it had a school for younger children that would then feed into this art academy, and the younger children would follow exactly the same curriculum from age 10 or 11, drawing from life, drawing from casts, and studying all the figurative skills. So I was very fortunate in having these sort of two very diverse lives going on. On one hand, I was attending the Sterligov meetings, the nonconformist art exhibitions, where people who, the artists tried to break out of this figurative, very conformist Soviet socialist style. And by day, I would be studying the figurative, very rigorous figurative training, drawing Apollo busts, Venus busts, and all those things day in, day out. So it was a very interesting, very sort of contradictory, but very rich ground to, I guess, develop ideas, and above all, to develop a sense that there is no one single format, social format that can answer creative needs, can answer human needs. And of course, that brings the capacity to question, why did we have to leave Ukraine? Why did we have those two formats that have to be conflicting? So there's a lot of challenging questions that were present in my sort of early development, and I think that formed the way I've carried on looking at art, carried on looking and developing my personal artworks in the end. So my next step was going to Art Academy in St. Petersburg. It was sort of in the 90s. It was suddenly a very different society. A revolution, the empire was collapsing. It was really fascinating time, and I think being very young and suddenly having this experience of complete anarchy was great and fascinating. It was a good age to be present at collapse of a country. I didn't feel, I feel more sort of exhilarated rather than threatened, and I think that was quite fortunate, because certainly for a lot of people who've grown up within that format, it was absolutely terrifying. And I remember playing lots of pranks with the way that there were people who'd gather and protest against the separation of certain countries, and we, with some of the students, we played a prank where we staged a fake not a protest, but a fake group meeting to say that we wanted one of the islands in St. Petersburg to become part of a different republic. And we instantly had groups of grannies protesting there and shouting, and it seemed the funniest thing ever. So it was good. It was a good and interesting time. But on the practical terms, the funding in the academy completely disappeared. The crime level was horrendous, and I've seen people being shot on the streets in St. Petersburg. And now looking back at that period in the 90s was also the time when it was sort of formative time for the Putin and for the system that was emerging. And there were very prevalent scenes of very odd group gangs who used to color code their suits. So we had people gangs who used to wear a sort of burgundy suits. And you could tell the kind of little mafia groups that is going, and some used to wear those darker green suits. And then other groups would wear sort of Adidas track suits. And you'd see those small groups going around terrorizing businesses, taking people off the streets. And it was quite scary, but you could see and experience the formation of this system where the small gangs get then bullied by the bigger gangs which then absorbed the smaller gangs. And it slowly went from just a random thugs going around to a lot more formed groups, which in essence haven't changed the system of interaction, but have just grown bigger and bigger and bigger, which if I'm honest, I can see how some of the behavior that from early 90s in those sort of group gangs can be translated on the larger scale of what's happening in kind of post-Soviet Russia now. And it's being able to look back at these situations now, one can sort of see the emergence of some of those patterns that one can sort of think about and reflect back on. But for my part, I felt that it was very difficult to continue education in academy, and through some personal circumstances, I decided to transfer for a while to St. Martin's in London, and it was a really great opportunity to see the galleries, to get to know a very different approach to creating art, very different way of thinking about art. And of course, St. Martin's was based in Soho at the time, so sort of diving straight into that very rich life in Soho was quite fascinating. It was really great fun and a big change. So that's quite a lengthy introduction there, but I felt that the history comes in now in very different colors, and some of those little details that one have forgotten come up with completely different light and bring different meaning to what's happening now. And you suddenly see those patterns, see those separate incidents as part of a larger pattern, and you can trace that back deeper into history, which I think is important way to see also how the art can bring to the surface, hopefully highlight some of those points and keep that in mind, keep that history flowing. So I'd like to probably skip forward a little bit to Trinity, and I'd like to move into some of the images. Let me have a look. I'll try and share my screen.
Sorry,
so
I have to wait. Can you wait a second? I have to set it, otherwise you cannot share. Now you should be able to share.
Okay, yeah. So while I was in London, just to say quickly, I was exhibiting in different galleries. I found my way around the art scene. I've taken part in some of the competitions, for example, BP Portrait Award. I've taken part several times, and I won the Travel Award, where I went to Ukraine. And I've tried to put together a piece of that reflected on the lives of people through the last century, from Ukraine and Russia, in fact. And I've done the portraits from the youngest person, who's a 7-year-old. And there were sort of quick sketches and the record of their memories. So we had a little chapter of them talking about themselves. And the oldest person was 98, and she was from a very old Russian aristocratic family. And she told a little bit about her history and family and persecution of her family, where she had to lose her name to cover up for her aristocratic background. So it was an overview from different social backgrounds, from politicians to peasants and farmers. And there was this sort of little history in pictures and in personal stories. So that was an interesting highlight. So I've worked my way through different sort of artistic endeavors, and I'd like to jump over straight to the time where I've sort of started to feel that I would like to move on and achieve a larger project with my life. And I was quite interested in the kind of bigger scale relationship between the way that this social kind of interactions between individual and larger groups work, and our the way we form our sort of relationship with the cosmos, with interpret our sort of existence. And I was interested in finding a place where I could realize this project. I applied to Trinity. I was invited to apply to Trinity, and I got a phone call from Sir Martin Rees, who very kindly personally called me to say that my application was accepted and that I was accepted as a fellow in creative arts in Trinity in 2009. So it was really a life-changing experience. It was really fascinating. I apologize. I need to adjust my screen a little bit. There we go. So now, can everybody see the portrait? Is that working?
Yes, very good, very good.
Brilliant. So I was invited to work on the project, on creative project that was really dealing with a way one can reinterpret a historical painting. And at the time was quite fascinated with the way that Velázquez and Rubens have interpreted history and interpreted the events that were important to their century. And I wanted to put together a series of works that could work with history as it's happening in the present society, but from a point of view of an artist that's not under a influenced by sort of royal family who would commission usually. So how would an independent artist create this overview of history in the present society? And it was while I was working on these projects and developing them that Martin Rees was due for a portrait as a master of Trinity, and I was asked to if I would paint his portrait. And it was a great honor to be asked. I'm a very big fan of his work. I was very interested in how our view of the universe, of our place in the universe, is changing with science, how our perception of what it means to be a human being is expanded by the way through the expansion of scientific research, how we can interpret ourselves in a very different ways. Our body can be seen through a microscope or be seen in context of this sort of grand scale of the universe. So I followed his lectures, and I was finally invited to paint him. It was really a fantastic opportunity, and we worked on his portrait in his lodge, and we set up a little space where I could have Martin model for me for 40 minutes at a time. So before lunch, he would come in and we'll have a chat, and he'll model. And I was working on creating his presence. So I worked partly from the photograph to sketching just to sketching the costume, to sketching the suit and the details of the clothing. But for the expression, for the details in the face, I felt it was really important to have the person present, to get that direct engagement, to get the direct gaze. I had my palette, I had my little portable travel easel set up that's been with me since the art school, and traveled from St. Petersburg to many locations, and landed in Trinity. And it was very much about capturing that interaction, that as a human factor that one can only build up through prolonged contact with a person. So I find when one takes a photograph, it captures an instant of person's mood, of person's expression. However, if you take that time to look at person for several hours on different days, on different moods, you somehow accumulate all those little changes. You accumulate those little micro moods that are characteristic of a person. Another element that I find interesting is that when one takes a photograph, you often find the person will pose, they will have a specific expression they want to convey. Whereas with several hours, you can't maintain that expression. So a person falls back into their natural presence. And that is the moment that I look for. And often I try to have a conversation with the person that I'm painting. So when their mind is focused on the things they're interested in, when their mind is alive with their passion, with things that convey what they've been able to contribute to the society, to the world, when that's present in their expression at the time, it also comes across in the portrait. Then it's easier to capture those things. And being a big fan of Martin's work, I felt it was really important for me to try and bring that into the portrait, to have that saved for the students, for people, for everybody who are going to get to look at his portrait in the hall, to be inspired. And that's becoming a more and more kind of important factor in my thinking about the art, and the purpose of making portraiture and making art is the importance of the influence that individuals bring into the society, into the formation of the country, so that individual contribution to what the world is, the best that the world can offer. So it was a really good fun, and Martin was quite curious about the experience. So here's a photograph of him assessing the portrait in progress. It's always a terrifying moment for an artist, whether the model is going to approve or not. But he seemed to be quite happy with it, or at least he was calm. So it was a very, very beautiful experience that led to other portraits that I've followed on to work on at Trinity. And I was asked to paint some of the portraits that commemorate 20 years of fellowship at Trinity. So if you may know that after 20 years of fellowship, fellow has the right to, Trinity asks to have a commemorative portrait of that fellow, so we can have Trinity can have a record of that person. It's tradition that dates back quite a long way. Usually it would be a drawing, and we've sort of expanded a little bit. I felt that maybe a painting sketch would be a lot more engaging. Now Trinity even opened up to photography, so we're stepped into the 20th century. So there are several fellows whose portrait I've worked on. There's Keith Moffat, Sachiko Kosukawa, and a number of others that I'll come back to. But one of the interesting stories comes from painting John Bradfield, who was a bursar, former bursar at Trinity, and has had a huge contribution.
Senior bursar.
Senior bursar.
Senior
Yes,
bursar. I remember him very well. He's amazing. He is instrumental in much of the endowment, and he created the science park and many other investments.
Yes, so Felix Stowe was also his contribution. So he has changed the life of Trinity quite a lot, and but he refused to have his portrait painted. And there was Martin was quite a good friend of John Bradfield, and he and Trinity devised a cunning plan to try and persuade somehow, through any means possible, to get John to cooperate. So we tried to sort of talk him into the idea. We went on several fascinating walks around the science park that John Bradfield told us about, and showed us a lot of unique species of plants growing around Science Park, around the lake. It was really beautiful, very gentle and very passionate person that I've really grown to kind of have a deep respect, and really lucky to have that engagement with him. So we've, after long deliberations, we've agreed that his greatest passion was Catherine Parr, who was the last wife of Henry VIII. And he was rather disappointed that Trinity didn't have her portrait in the Great Hall, and she wasn't represented among the people who have contributed so much to Trinity. And he felt that unless she was present amongst the fellows in the amongst the beneficiaries in the Great Hall, he didn't felt comfortable to have his contribution recorded. So Trinity has agreed that a portrait of Catherine Parr will be painted and hung in the Great Hall on the as a condition for John Bradfield having his portrait painted. So we've come to that agreement eventually, and I was very fortunate to paint two portraits. I've painted this particular portrait as the first option, and somehow I think John Bradfield wasn't quite comfortable with it. I think he didn't quite like the dark outline around his face. So we made a second attempt, and the second portrait is now in Trinity's collection. And this portrait have become part of a collection of John Bradfield Centre. So it was quite fortunate. There was two portraits, and the only two portraits ever painted of John Bradfield from life rather than from photograph. That takes us to the portrait of Catherine Parr that have come next as the sort of per our agreement. So the agreement was between Martin Rees and John Bradfield to have this portrait. Trinity was considering using one of the portraits in existence already in Trinity's collection of Catherine Parr. But the decision was made that in the end, it will be a new portrait commissioned to paint from. Now, I felt that at Trinity Hall had a great presence of male dignitaries. It was great to have a finally sort of female figure represented, but also a lot of paintings in the hall had a very deep, dark background. And obviously Martin's portrait was no exception. I'll come back to a little bit maybe on the details of the background there. So I felt that there was one painting at the top of the top of the great table, by Joshua Reynolds, that had this portrait of a boy with a beautiful bright blue sky background, and I felt it really brought life to the hall, and it also reminded us of the origins, that in the end there is that a kind of childlike wonder and lightness that's also important in I think in the life of any person, in the life, especially if one endeavors to achieve something, one has to be able to have that moment of letting go of the sort of slightly very formal presence and find that inspiration that comes from a wonder that you have when you're a child. And I wanted to have a little dialogue between that lightness and sort of cheerfulness, I guess, in the Reynolds portrait and in the background to Catherine Parr. So when I was looking for a portrait to work from, it was agreed that it will be a sort of a copy of some, to a degree, of Catherine Parr. I found a portrait in the National Portrait Gallery of Catherine Parr that was done in full length, and she looked like she had a really beautiful presence in this portrait. And from what we talked about with John Bradfield, his biggest inspiration was that she was a very intelligent woman, a very strong person, and very confident. And that's something that was quite a rare thing in Tudor. She was the first woman to venture into publishing. She wrote hymns in support of his military campaign. She was, above all, a very big influence on preserving the learning institutions and influencing Henry VIII in appreciating the value of learning and Trinity as a place of learning. So this portrait went beyond just capturing the face. It had that intelligent engagement, I felt, in the eyes. There was conveying that very very strong presence of Catherine Parr. So the agreement was that I will only do a half-length portrait, and the challenge for me was how to convert this full-length image into a smaller work in a convincing way. The portrait was done by somebody called Master John at the time, who also painted a portrait of Mary, Queen Mary, and that was a half-length portrait where you could see the sleeves are half cut off, the hands are slightly higher up at her, just sort of covering the abdomen a little bit higher than in the full-length portrait. So there's not a large difference. So my decision was to shift the hands slightly higher up and trim the edges of the fur sleeves, and thus convert the full-length portrait into this half-length image. So you can see how the background was also very much influenced by the Queen Mary's portrait that was a lot lighter and brighter. So it was very much a creative interpretation of a Tudor work. And if I can stop sharing for a minute. So I'd like to just have a little tour. So I went into the National Portrait Gallery in hope to copy from the original work, but because of the restrictions of the gallery, I wasn't able to do that. So I proceeded to go every day to the gallery and make little swap samples for different colors and paints to try and work my way through. So for about 6 months, I worked at the image, and I've made multiple layers of different colors to achieve that richness and complexity, making nodes above nodes and working out how this could be. I took a little sheets that I could work from, and then for each layer, I would test a layer on the piece of paper. I would take that into the gallery and then try and recreate that in the sort of home, in the studio environment. So I had multiple tests, and I would come in and just work my way through them. So for different colors, for the hands, as you can see, the hand, seeing the backgrounds. So eventually I ended up with having a little test work that was done in the studio, and then I recorded different layers and all the processes at the background, at the back. So the portrait that you see in Trinity is almost a second attempt, so a second work that was done following those multiple tests that were taken through the to the gallery. So if I can share, go back to sharing. Share the screen. Okay. Have we got a picture? So as you can see, the interesting thing about also the portraiture, Tudor portraiture, it was very much about the sort of tour de force, about the showing the riches of the family. So the brooch on the Catherine Parr's costume is the identification brooch that was given to her by Henry VIII, which is how we can identify that that's Catherine Parr in the portrait. The colors and the paints that were used again gave the idea of how wealthy the it's sort of a way of showing your status, which was quite a challenge because, of course, in the original portrait, it's the silver that was used, the original silver and gilding that were used for the dress. The red color was traditionally used, the vermilion, and there was a meaning to each color. So vermilion is a combination of sulfur and mercury, which have a sort of a cosmological meaning of the marriage of a unicorn and a dragon, and the context of those sort of sacred beings being present in the royal costume, in the royal, all spoke to the person. So a person who would be looking at this image would be well versed in the meaning of each color, of each element that's been used in the painting, because those are very, very toxic paints, and trying to recreate something like this using modern material can be quite a challenge. Follow this sort of idea of investing the meaning into the backgrounds, into the details, which can then be either research. I wanted to take it further, and as one of the common techniques in research into the painting is used as a sort of carbon dating of the materials used throughout the paint. I wanted to introduce a little secret dedication. So in the corner of this portrait, written underneath the layers of paint, in the black paint, which would be easily readable in any kind of carbon detecting meaning, is a little dedication to Martin Rees and Sir John Bradfield as their thank you for their commission of this portrait, and acknowledging their idea. It is not visible to naked eye, but if anybody was to ever look into it, the presence is there. So it was my little legacy to them, if I could leave something. Going back a little bit to Martin's portrait, the background here was again bringing a little hidden story, where at the time the images of the redshift in the at the time of sort of formation of the universe, the very early images of the universe were coming through. It was the sort of first map. It was just around that time appeared the first map of the very early stages of the universe, and I've noticed there was this rich red background that was present in the images that was also often used in classical paintings. So the portrait was painted on the same color as the color of this red shift in the images of the early universe, and the folds of the fabric were introduced a little bit like the sort of the folds of the fabric of the universe. And this a little object at the bottom of the portrait again was referring back to some of the classical paintings, how in a portrait of ambassadors by Holbein, you have a skull as a reminder of the preoccupation that was, I guess, about sort of mortality and life and death. That was important here. It's the image of a sort of a stellar nursery, one of the nebulas. Of course, that's again the period when a lot of fantastic Hubble imagery was coming through, and you could not be sort of taken by it. So the image of one of the those nebulas with a remarkable number, I think 38, that was introduced here just as a sort of reminder of, you know, a bigger scale. That, you know, when you think about the scale of the universe, all the other, I think, preoccupations kind of fade, and one can really appreciate a bigger picture. So I was hoping that could be a little token gesture to that tradition of introducing a meaning into a portrait. So to move on a little bit on my experience at Trinity, another portrait you might see in the Great Hall. So I'm just sort of touring a little bit around the Great Hall. If any of you find yourself dining there again sometime soon. On the right side, above the table with salads, there's another portrait, which is a copy, again, interpretation of a portrait from the Cavendish Laboratory of Lord Rayleigh. And that was a parting gift by Mike Proctor. He was a Trinity Fellow for a very long time, researching into the sun and astrophysics. And he was moving to King's, and as his parting gift, he commissioned to have this half-length interpretation of Lord Rayleigh. So you could see Martin Rees on the left in the line with the fellows for the Masters of Trinity. You can see Catherine Parr next to the soups, and in the left cave, and you can see Lord Rayleigh on the right above the salads. So I feel I've worked hard on my contribution to the Great Hall so far. Among other portraits, there is more recently, so the portrait of Jean Calfa is also contributed a lot to the art collection in the library. He's been researching into the philosophy and sort of art and literature of the 20th century. So he's been quite a big influence on by bringing a lot of very interesting, fascinating books into Trinity Library and inspiring in that way. And the very last portrait that I've worked, that I was just contributed last month, that's of Emma Widdis, who is a researcher in Slavonic studies, so on Russian literature. And it is a very interesting timing, of course, where one has to rethink our previous interpretation of Russian literature, especially in the light where the question of what is Russian literature, whether one can say, for example, Gogol has been very much seen as a Russian writer because he was part of that Russian Empire, and by default was conditioned into writing in Russian language because Ukrainian language writing was forbidden at the time. Therefore, some of his work is in Ukrainian, but a lot of it mainly in Russian. And he lived in Russia. Therefore, his career choices would have had to connect him very tightly with that Russian background. Yet, can he be considered Russian writer, or the subject matter and the and his conditions, his circumstances could be interpreted in a different way? And that has to be looked at a lot of sort of the musicians, sort of a lot of cultural heritage that come from that sort of moment where empire comes into questioning. So this is my a little essay on the works that are now part of Trinity Collection. This sort of takes me to the work that I've come to develop at Trinity. So just before coming to Trinity, I was working on the way to connect the sort of geometry and the way we kind of the language of mathematics, the language of abstract shapes and interpretation of movement, interpretation of dynamic, and connecting that with figurative elements and perception, and how one can enhance the language or connect the language of figurative, the story, the presence of the idea that's going into the work, and how can one interpret it through the language of lines and shapes, and then merge that together. So I guess what I've mentioned earlier about attending the classes of Sterligov and sort of Malevich learning has had a very big influence on this, how the thinking in terms of shapes and lines and their way of influencing our perception has a lot to do with how we then direct everything else that goes into the painting to complete the thought. So I was working on an image called a zinc, titanium, lead, ivory. Zinc refers to zinc white paint. So each paint used here are only in the main parts of the painting are zinc white, titanium white, lead white, and ivory black. Another black that was also used, that's not in the title, is Mars black. So those are the core black and whites that are used in the paintings by contemporary artists. And this was the beginning of my work becoming a lot more engaged with the natural elements and thinking about how natural elements that formed development of our society, how they've also found their way in our interpretation of our painting, our culture, and how one as an artist can use those elements with more awareness. So each painting for me is a sort of a laboratory where I pose a question, and being very much a visual person, I work through those questions through visual means. And the lines, the shapes have a long history. So we, from sort of Greek culture, Western, so from Western art, have interpreted squares and square shapes or anything that with rectangles as very solid shapes. A circle often comes across in culture as a dynamic form, a form of movement. Triangle is often a shape that either symbolizes or translates into, again, a movement and directional movement. Same again with a curved line, there is an element of a calm but also dynamic shape as well. So how can one manipulate those historically formed, already sort of formed concepts, and how can one bring them into the modern history, the modern environment, the modern events? How can one connect things that we experience with those shapes and then use them as a part of a language to work on the problem? So each painting is not necessarily a resolved problem, but it is an invitation to follow with those questions, to follow with those lines, to follow with those elements, and take each person on their individual journey by connecting with some of the details that are brought into life in the painting to hopefully sort of resolve that problem for each person. There is no conclusion that can be set, because each person will bring their own experiences. So the questions in this particular work, as a first foremost referring to the origin of the paints. Titanium white, again, titanium is one of the strongest metals used in sort of, again, in constructions, and titanium white have been developed, I believe, by a fellow at Trinity. And in the background, you can see lines of the contemporary business architecture. That's when I was living in London, has just literally, it was growing so fast, and the city area was developing at astonishing speed. What I found quite challenging to connect with is that this work was done in the 2000s, so there's still a lot of images coming from the Rwandan atrocities, the suffering that was happening around the world, and a lot of the images in the newspapers were of so great tragedies that were happening around the world. And the little pink slices, as you can see in the, if I can zoom in, unfortunately can't see the detail very well. Yeah, I'll see what the next image. So this is work in progress, got better resolution. So these are a little bit sort of sketched in light. So the color of the pink here is used from the FT, a reference to the FT newspaper, and how these kind of mental images are sliced onto the image of a growing city, growing economy, growing sort of businesses, and trying to reconcile this a clash, a sort of mental clash between extreme deterioration and extreme prosperity happening at the same time, that somehow meet at the center point, which is a FT newspaper, becoming a visual carrier of both elements. So having this very precarious and challenging clash has translated into the clash of those two shapes, a triangle, a sort of a square shape on its side that's both precarious but also a solid shape, and a dynamic shape of sort of exploding ball, which is the image of a protest in Philippines at the time. And on both sides you can see figures working away, some having images that inspire them, which are images from the newspapers, but different pages from, let's say, newspapers, if you can see the close interpretation. So page 3 versus page about the news in around the world. So this thought of how can one address those seemingly conflicting sides of development in society. How can one represent this precariousness and this figure sitting on this very, very unstable ball that's about to explode, that's about to move on, with their eyes closed, being fed what's supposed to be sort of an eagle representation of power, was a sort of visual way to try and express that sense of imbalance, sense of being torn between the different worlds. Regarding the color paint, zinc, again, it has a history. A lot of children in the third world die from lack of zinc, one of the most sort of present elements. In Soviet history, zinc was a very, very present dark reference to the war in Afghanistan, because hundreds upon hundreds of young soldiers were coming back in zinc coffins. So in my childhood, the zinc was very much associated with this Soviet failure at Afghanistan and conflict. Mars is Mars black. Mars is a god of war. So the use of the word, the name in this paint, again, brings the references to that contradiction and conflict. Ivory, black, although was used for manuscripts, and although it's a very simple charred bone, black, it was often used as only ivory was allowed to be used in the manuscripts because of the sacredness of the elephant, and only the sacred animal bones were allowed to be present, to be used in the writing of the Holy Bible, whereas obviously chicken bone can produce the same black, but wouldn't necessarily fit well with the context. So there are multiple layers in constructing this image, and whether one can read into them or perceive all of them is not so much of an essence. It is very much about the process of creating and answering those questions through being able to touch upon these questions during the research, touch upon these challenges for me to try to resolve my presence in this time, in this century, my purpose for existence, so to speak. So when I came to Trinity, I I followed on with this research, and I referred back to the media, mass media, newspaper imagery for references. And I also wanted to connect with all the wealth of knowledge, a wealth of information that was available at Trinity, to bring in our understanding of who we are and how we interpret ourselves, how we see ourselves in this new century, new context. And what's striking for me is that, let's say, in the contrast to a medieval person, we don't just see ourselves as a flesh and body, or maybe spirit as it would have been. When we see an image of a mitochondria, we understand that it's still part of human body. When we see our blood cells, or sort of on a micro level, we can very quickly connect with the things that, although we're not able to see with the naked eye, we can connect with this interpretation of a human on the completely different scales, on atomic scale, on cosmological scale. So I was kindly offered to have a tour of a microbiology lab by Gregory Winter, and then followed by sort of looking at the some of the displays and some of the images that have come out of the mitochondria. And in particular, I remember that also Jason Chin, who's will be featured on your talk very soon, offered me to have a look at the ribosomes and talked about the role of the ribosome in the human body. So the image on the left, I will show you, I will return to it. Image on the left is utilizing the geometry of the ribosome cells. And what I found really fascinating in their behavior, and it is very loose artistic interpretation of it, is that what really inspired me from what he said is that ribosomes, when they reach a point where they're uncomfortable with their environment, they work together to unify and to build up in order to exit the environment they're not happy with and to break out into a new environment. And I was quite fascinated by how that can really draw parallels very much on the way that social movements work in a very similar way. So at some point, when country becomes quite dissatisfied, and humans have this ability to self-organize, to come together and to change, to break out of the conditions they find inappropriate to live with. So the geometry that's introduced in the work is that of the ribosomes overlapping sort of in a dynamic way, growing, evolving, and the images that sliced into these shapes are of the cars. There was very much at the time when there was a lot of bombing, a lot of car bombing was happening in the Afghanistan and in Iraq, and the what I found quite fascinating, that in the media that was again source for the work at the time, casts seem to become very present as a substitute to the image of our body. So rather than showing a body killed in the explosion, which would have been sort of a bit too graphic, there was often an image of a car exploding. So somehow, especially at that time, the car have taken up a very, very prominent place. And when one is talking to a person sometimes about their car, there's a lot of affection. People very closely associate themselves with their car. It becomes sort of part of their family. And I got quite interested in this link between the car that's interpreted as an extension of our personality, of our body, that also very much a product of an oil economy, of the energy production that in the first place have caused the explosions, the conflict based on the access to the resources was the source of those discontent, of the explosions that were happening in Iraq. And the car was used as a weapon in this conflict, yet the car itself is the source for that, for the conflict. And this dichotomy, again, this multi-layered conflict that feeds back into our into our connectedness with the car and our sort of personal investment, have become the source for this picture. At the top there, far left, there is an image from the oil refinery with pipes. Again, the left corner has a image from the disasters. I think it was after Fukushima. There was a lot of images of the cars being sort of destroyed in the tragedy. In terms of composition, this is referring to the Dutch art style of vanitas, still lifes. So in 18th century, where the religious work in Holland wasn't permitting the depiction of a human being, the image started to be focused on allegorical representation of Christ, of discussion or contemplation of life and death and futility of pleasures. The structure of the imagery was very much based on having the red at the top of the image, where the red flower would represent Christ, and different colors placed in different to create a sort of very strong composition. So you can see at the top here is the red color slowly merging down to create a triangle that holds together the piece through color and through line. That's very much referring back to this vanitas, still life, and the sentiment of contemplating sort of the life and our place in the longer and the bigger picture through the imagery of objects that we come into contact with in life, we come into use, and we come into attachments. So the attachments and the futility of those attachments, I guess. So going back to the this is a diptych, so second part here uses image of mitochondria, so that very stylized shape of mitochondria, into which the shapes of the bodies are placed, and various detritus. Now, I had a fantastic studio that Trinity had offered me, which was a huge warehouse, and I filled half of it with boxes, piles of plastic, like everything. So every day I had bits of computers, bits of pipes. You can, whether you could see, there's pieces of papers, boxes, fabrics, computer parts and elements, shoes, syringes, everything that a human being could accumulate and throw out and go through in life. Yet the bodies themselves remain the bodies, because in essence, we come naked, we go naked. So the presence of naked body is an attempt to detach our obsession with stuff and the volumes of stuff that we go through in life and that wastefulness in society, an attempt to detach it from the actual being that stands behind it, and to separate it from, and try to create that, again, as in the Vanitas paintings, to create that separation between the, I guess, sort of the fleeting necessity of the object in life, and contemplate again the environmental hazards, the environmental catastrophe that we've produced. So as I've said earlier, it is my take on what Rubens was doing, Velázquez was doing, of contemplating the history through the means of references to the events, to what is the most poignant thoughts and urgent matters in our society, and creating a form of record of how we are. And that's all seen through, obviously, my personal perspective. So there is that reference to conflict. Again, this is another version on the same subject, going more and more into the contemplation of bodies almost merging into this detritus. So somehow us losing our perspective of who we are, being completely buried in stuff, for the lack of better words. So that's the set of works, one of the thoughts and directions that I've explored during that time at Trinity, which has taken me to the kind of next few levels. The work on the environment and the context that we create for ourselves. So exploring the conflict, exploring our interaction. Often once you start on one painting, when you start on one thought, that leads you to another thought and leads you to another thought. And this produces what seems to be kind of visually disconnected imagery. So how can you jump from the image of bodies to an image of pipes? Yet it is a continuation of a thought of environment that humans have constructed, and where we live, how we live in the present. And this image is from the steel mill in Ukraine. So this is going back to Zaporizhstall, where I'll talk a bit further about it, and in Ukraine. And the conflict and resolution, I guess, here was to explore the linear perspective that have become ever present in our environment, and the natural lines and natural presence, the presence of nature, how humanity is very sort of drawn away from it. And the thought that has occurred, produced this image, or sort of led me to this image, is an article on how a lot of Aboriginal people who've been introduced into the cities in Australia and been placed into modern housing to provide for them. So what was seen as a sort of a gesture of help and support have been incredibly destructive to the cohesion of the Aboriginal person as their sort of their self-perception. And often what would happen is some of those families would knock one of the walls out of the building that they would be, or the house that would be placed, because they couldn't cope with this four-wall enclosure. They've lived for centuries in the very open spaces, and suddenly being put in those very closed-in spaces would lead to a lot of suicides and a lot of very serious alcoholic problems. So some of the families would literally just knock down one of the walls to open up that space. And I found this fascinating, how we further and further lock ourselves up into these very linear lines, yet how we can often refer to the sort of forest of pipes or forest of buildings using the language that dates back to our very, very old ways of sort of living. So what I've done with this painting is, if you can see, maybe in the areas just below where the flat areas, there are rectangles, and each subsequent rectangle have been the painting have been divided into 1,000 rectangles, and each next rectangle has been blanked out by masked out by a masking fluid. And into this space, I've painted an image of a tree from the southeast Ukraine, so from the forests in southeast Ukraine. And it was, again, exploring a way of the sort of a philosophy, a way of thinking about trying to take away the imposition of the aesthetic and allowing the natural development of work through setting conditions, mathematical conditions. So there was no, the only aesthetic choice was, I suppose, the photograph that I used of the steel mill and the image of the tree. And that conflict and that sort of tag of man-made environment and disappearance of the natural environment, and how can one sort of in the painting reverse these processes. So I've peeled away all the rectangles, so each next rectangle that within the image of the factory, and painted into it the sort of projected image of the tree. So in essence, this painting no longer exists. It has been transformed, destroyed, and through this destruction process, a new entity is emerging. And this is how it looks in a close-up. So you can see how the trunk of the tree emerges through the pipes. But what I found also interesting is that when showing the image, so this is the completed section, I have to admit, it is still work in progress. I still haven't finished it. It's been a very long endeavor. But somehow those lines between the trees and the pipes are started to connect, and they're connecting into their own form of a forest, into their own sort of world and entity. I found that this is an unintended event of evolution, of integration between the man-made environment and the natural environment. So questions started to emerge. Is this evolution in our mind? Is this something that we naturally drawn to impose, finding the patterns, finding the mathematical connections, finding the visual connections? Or is there some integral sort of element in our nature, in our evolution, that draws us to connect between the natural lines of trees and then bring that into our architecture, our forms? That's a question, that's an open question, and I think that's an open question for each person. I had some people come looking at this work and they've seen this as a graveyard with the tombstones. Some people seen it as a kind of a sort of futuristic building. So every person brings a different reading to this piece. I think that's the beautiful part, because that unique experience that every person can bring can hopefully come together and in creating more answers and more solutions, more breakthroughs in our perception. So in that sense, I feel Trinity had allowed me with this particular project to start on something I would have never been able to embark on by giving this 2 years to think and to work on incredibly detailed, incredibly involved work that under normal circumstances, very few artists would have opportunity to do. So I hope this fellowship that Trinity have been running has a chance to offer to many artists in the future, because it's very probably one in a million of opportunities to have 2 years of research with no financial pressure, with no other pressures, and there's no other residency, I think, in the world that gives that consistent long time to go as deep as you possibly can, but then also have time to physically create something with this research. So have thinking time, have development and research time, and then have enough production time. And as I've run out of production time on this one, but even as far as I could, I think that has been a worthwhile. And who knows, I might still get a chance to continue it one day to show the full picture. Give me another 10 years. So to the next part that sort of led to further interest with this industrial environment, with the production of energy, production of oil, and our engagement with oil. This is, again, a huge work, and I must say the previous one also, it's 2.5 meters. So it's the size of your average wall in the room. They are enormous pieces, and they were exhibited in the university library, where these huge walls were really perfect setting. So this work is an image from the BP oil refinery, where I've taken a tour in Hull, so in Britain. And the thought in this work, the dominating thought, was how does one represent power and through history, and what language, what means of power representation have been used in 16th century, 18th century art, and whether one can use some of those architectural elements of representing that power to work with the current I guess current forces that exert power on our society. So the choice was to use an oil refinery, as the oil has been a very dominant formative power behind history of 20th century, 21st century. And I thought about the domes of cathedrals and the murals in Italian, I guess, 16th century cathedrals, and also in a lot of ceiling paintings in great palaces across European countries who've had dealt with this representation of power. And often when you look up the dome, when you look up at the ceiling, you often have this composition with Christ or the religious power represented in the center, surrounded by light, surrounded by the halo, and then the elements of the sort of earthly powers. You might have representation of mythological representation or symbolical representations of glory, the nymphs and the gods surrounding the Christ figure, and then you would often have the royal figures or the intellectual figures surrounded yet again in the next layer of imagery. So the composition was taken from those domes, with a center with this glowing bright white light that emanates with a sort of dissipating shimmers emanating outwards, and the compositional kind of interpretation of the same kind of problem. So that was exploration of that subject in the context of composition and interpretation in history. This was more literal, again, take on the same subject. Here's portraits of CEOs of the main companies, oil companies that were influencers, I guess, exerting the biggest influence in, I guess, 2009, 2010, when I was a fellow. And this was an attempt to use our visual means to reference the interconnectedness. So this is a panel, 4 panels that can be taken apart and remixed, and I wanted to have that compositional connection that can be broken apart, that can be disconnected. So the decision was made compositionally to use 4 separate elements. Here again, you have little slices of FT colored imagery that again, for each part, references some of the key concerns from each of those companies and each of those representatives. So a slightly different contemplation on the subject, going again in the tradition of historical painting and what one can consider as creating a historical painting in this century. So these works, they haven't sort of, when I was getting ready for the talk, brought me back to looking at some of the works that I've done very early on. This is done in 1990s, one of my first earliest works just after the college, and it brought back the realization that I've worked on the subject of a conflict for a very long time, and a conflict can be something that emerges on so many levels and so many forms, and each time it produces a different language, and especially how we define different sides. And for each time we define a new conflict, we use a new language and we create new ways of delineating the separations and the sides. And that's a necessary part of resolving the conflict, to be able to define the sides, to create a language for describing the influence each side exerts. But it also can sometimes cover up the unique and individual background and context for each side. So this is dealing with a family. This is a painting called Family. These screaming figures in the background, I guess taken from the reading some of the sort of books on the psychology, where which talk about the language of our family, of our fathers and our family background, finding its way into the way we talk to the partner. How do we talk to each other in the family? So a lot of conflict within the family, as defined in this book, emerges not even so much through conflict between the two people, but through conflict between the way each family operates, the language of each family, that then comes into conflict with each other. So even if people, two individual people, have a lot in common together, their backgrounds may clash. And it was very relevant for me at the time. I was having a little bit of a difficult time with my relationships, very much based on huge cultural differences between kind of my Ukrainian upbringing, Ukrainian Russian influence at that time as well, and a person with a British upbringing. It was a challenging time to learn about different language elements, different perception of rights, roles in the family. So this work was done much later. I was in, but again, sort of going back to how the family and what language we use in creating the understanding of the conflict from childhood. And it was very much inspired from my experience of being an assistant in one of the artists in residence, more to say, in a very elite school, and a boarding school here in Cambridge. And what I find quite surprising is how early, from what a young age, the children were trained in the military discipline with the real guns. And to me, it came a bit as a shock. And I remember when I was a child in the Soviet Union, we had drills where once every 3-4 months, we had to put on our gas masks and go down to we had a siren, an emergency siren, and we had to go down to the school basement, and the boys had to put together a Kalashnikov gun or disassemble and reassemble Kalashnikov gun, and the girls had to bandage an imaginary wound. So the girls were trained as nurses, and that started from about age 8 or 9, as far as I can remember. So that was very much a part of Soviet education, and I didn't anticipate it, I guess, to see that in sort of British school. So I got quite interested in how that language of being a hero and heroism, about defending your country, is implemented as part of military training. Yet the language of loss and tragedy often overlooked in the same training. So it is very much about the bravado, the heroism, the greatness of using a gun, and never about the death, the trauma. And it came very close to me because, again, the image I showed earlier, the figure in white, was very much the product, the painting that I've made earlier, the zinc titanium ivory, was a result of me working in as an interpreter, as my part-time job, in mental hospitals, in traumatic services. I worked for hospital in Southeast London, in translating for people who've arrived from war zones in Georgia, Chechnya, and I translate for them from Russian language or Ukrainian, if there was, dealing with their experiences. And in particular, there was a client from Grozny who I worked with for many months, which told absolutely harrowing stories that I wouldn't dare really talk about. But what it taught me above all is the creativity that we see as part of the civilized human being, as the something that identifies a progressive, I suppose, epitomizes a positive aspect of humanity. That the same creativity, in fact, can also be used in destruction and be also advance and evolve to more and more incredible levels beyond even our imagination, given enough time and prolonged conflict. So in conflicts where young people become either prisoners or become prisoners of the gangs, or become involved in the conflict very early on, this dehumanizing and combined with desire and ability to create and be creative allows the evolution of torture, evolution of killing, evolution of all the destructive processes to go way beyond anything we could comprehend. So for me, the understanding of creativity have stopped being a unique element of an advanced society, but become a unique element to a human psychic that is very much connected to the context that psychic is. Humans can't stop being creative, yet the direction we can give this creativity is very, very much down to our responsibility. And the biggest fear of those prolonged conflicts is how that creativity will evolve and where will it take us, which is what brings me back to sort of little, so the reasons for choices of those works that I'm showing today, they're like little breadcrumbs that I hope will lead to come together as a thought on the conflict that we have today. So how these training of the language of the heroism and the creative interpretation of what a one-sided interpretation of conflict can take, given the creative potential of child's mind, who will evolve, who will take this thought further. And it is a very, very terrifying thing. Where can that evolve on its journey? Going back to the language and to this, I guess, sort of slightly context of this school, a lot of talk that I've encountered and through the experience, through the being in touch with some of the people that were going to the school and their sort of parents, some of the talk was about going on the hunting journeys in Africa, and this I guess a very much British post-colonial mentality of still using third world countries as the hunting ground. And it was sort of emerging as a trend as well for during the conflict in Iraq, for the individuals with a certain sort of royal status and the aristocratic status to sometimes be seen as visiting the places in Iraq, as whether as a charitable thing, but or as a kind of connect to the what's going on. And it reminded me of the ways that the traditional sort of aristocratic portraits in Britain, in some of the stately homes, you'd have a person posing with a gun, with their hunting dog, and with the game that they would acquire through this trip. So in this particular painting, the exploded car engine in the shape of this sort of semi-creative sort of deer or exotic animal shape is posed next to the person with a Kalashnikov after their visit, let's say, to this exotic location, third world exotic location with a conflict. So it's again a thought. It's not so much it's not a criticism, it's not a statement, but it is a reminder that the tradition is still there, and the way we use imagery again in the newspapers of posed in the third world country with those exploded cars is very much still falls back onto the language of a person from an advanced country visiting a less developed country and posing there with a sort of with their own interpretation of events and the choices. This one again is a language of conflict, and the thinking about the language of fear and justice, I guess. So the question of how one chooses, what things we choose to interpret and what things we choose to present during the conflict. Now, what I've found striking in the context of Ukrainian conflict, it's been the most televised conflict there have been, and it's somehow taken on this. It's got all the key elements for the a kind of live show that's been very popular kind of in America, where you have a victim, the underdog, a very powerful baddie, and a smaller victim is being able to resist this powerful force, and it's all televised live. There's a lot of grit, and it's the sort of biggest live show that that I think has been offered for consumption. And what I find also in some of the interviews, again within the style of those reality live shows, the interviewed person often asked, first of all, how do you feel? So the emphasis is on the emotional expression of their trauma on the show of feeling. So it's very, very much that sort of American reality show theme, but all done in the live action. And it's terrifying, if I'm absolutely honest, because that does distract a lot from actually what's going on. It is good that people are interested, but how this language have emerged through the history of those live shows, through what we choose to be a public access information, what we choose to ignore and what we choose to emphasize. Very much something that we need to bring to a discussion and to, I think, look closely once this, hopefully, once this war is over. I hope there will be a deep revision of an analysis of how this process of interpretation, engagement with public, and televising and the language created through this public engagement with the war have happened in this conflict. Again, this another little let's call it essay on Syria, going a bit earlier about the loss of memory and erasure of childhood. So there's a little person here who for whose the memory of childhood will very much be absent, either through traumatic stress memory, erosion, or sort of deterioration of what the environment that they would have grown up in, and deterioration into a very different entity. So coming closer to home, pardon me, a bit closer to home. So this was a work on the Ukrainian revolution, and this particular scene, again, I'm falling back on the depiction of the naked body, but this specific scene was during the time of demonstration when hundreds of people in winter taking their clothes off in the protest for the forces, for the government forces, the pro-Russian government forces, opening a water cannon on there was a small group of demonstrators who got dragged out at night out of their homes and stripped naked for taking part in the protest earlier that week. And then a water cannon from the fire engine was used in the -20 temperatures out in the winter and cold to chase them down the street as a sort of attempt at humiliating and putting them off. So when the news about this came across, hundreds of people taking their clothes off and stood in demonstration in the protest against this brutality, and that taken on then a violent ending, and then that protest again followed on into that next confrontation. So if you remember, there were several clashes until the escalation has reached the peak point. So I went to visit Kiev sometime after the revolution, taken a lot of images of the piles of tires and piles of detritus and the boxes of bottles ready to be filled with fuel, still on guard in case of further escalation and emergence. So these sort of taken me further about thinking about the conflicts that might emerge across the world based on the resources and struggle for resources. So this is called iron to water to iron. So thinking about how the elements that give us prosperity can also be used as weapons as in conflicts, and then in turn with the shortages of water can create further escalation of conflict around the world. So as I went further, so going back to more recent works, the subject of how one can now think about humanity and how can one go from depiction of conflict and contemplation of the negative and destruction to finding what is it that can bring us closer to more positive, more deeper interaction with what we are as a humans in our place. And that's sort of question that's been coming up for me personally. So this work is taken from the image that I've enlarged of a meteorite. So the pattern comes from the iron nickel meteorite. And as we know from science, some of those meteorites could have been responsible for emergence of life on planet Earth by bringing those little elements that have then evolved. So this is a contemplation of the beginning of life and the evolution of I'll flick through this quite quickly, so we've have a bit more time for the last part. This is again getting closer and closer to natural elements to reflect back on ourselves. This is an image taken from the something called desert rose. It's a rock you can find in deserts that have been at one point submerged under the sea. And into this image, you can see there are painted images of battle ships and various scenes of maritime kind of history of humanity. So going forward with exploration of how our history has imprinted itself on the current times, on the history of Earth, so this takes me back to the steel mill in Ukraine and what is going on now. This is one of the works that emerged from reflecting some painting and sort of photographs that I've taken of the steel mill. This is using a lot of symbolic language, so some of the pipes have become a bit more abstracted, and they shape up an eagle that's attacking a sort of a seagull, which is sometimes comes up in folklore of in Ukraine, but also a very sort of universal conflict between the powers. And it was interesting how that presence may be a more poignant today. So these sort of works that emerged after a visit to steel mill have become more and more relevant to what's going on now. So I'd like to go back to my last part. I can see I'm running over the time quite. Is everybody still got enough energy to listen to more stories?
I think we have quite a number here. I think almost everybody is still here. So it's up to you.
So my last chapter is on the steel mill called Ivan. And when I was in the steel mill in my residency, he was my model, he was my inspiration, and he's also taken me around the steel mill. We become really good friends. I felt that I got to really understand the way people worked there. There are people with a lot of creative interests. A lot of them had hobbies of painting. So they weren't just workers turning up, doing their day at the steel mill and going home. A lot of them finish their work very early. In their 40s, they go in retire, and often they take up their career. So he became an interior designer after he retired when he was 43. And then the war happened. I arrived at the steel mill in 2007 or 2008. I was painting a mural in Ukraine in the church. I was invited to paint a mural. And I was working, this is about 20 meters high up from the floor. It's very, very high on a very small ledge. So it was quite a challenging work. And I've met people, I was talking to some people from Zaporizhzhia, and I expressed my interest in going back to look at the industrial landscape that reminded me of childhood, and I wanted to revisit. That was very similar to the landscape in Dnipro, where I grew up. So both have very heavy steel industry cities. This is a main street in Zaporizhzhia, and in 1930s, I believe during Stalinist time, it participated in European competition of the new young cities, and it had won one of the prizes for a modern city with this very grand sort of Stalinist design, huge avenues and big grand building. Going back, Zaporizhzhia was the center for Ukraine's military power dating back to 14th, 15th century. Ukraine is in Zaporizhzhia. There was a center for the Cossacks who established Zaporizhska Sich, was a name for their encampment, but also for their sort of formation, which was one of the first republics in Europe. So it was a military republic within what was a feudal Ukraine at the time. So it has a very strong historical presence and the sense of independence, and that historical symbol for Ukraine that's very, very powerful for the fight for its freedom, for the fight for its independence that was taken up by this heroic figure of a Cossack, is a name for a military person from the siege from Zaporizhzhia that fought in many wars of independence throughout Ukraine's history. So it's a very, very powerful historical reference city. So I arrived there and was taken into the steel mill that spans many, many, many kilometers. It has its own infrastructure, its own food farms, its own, it's a city in itself that spans many kilometers. And of course, it was built in 1930s. It was one of the biggest industrial complexes built during the Stalin time. And it only closed during the Second World War for 3 days from the direct hit, and then been quickly restored. So that implies two things. It's a very environmentally challenging place. As you can see, it is a gloomy day, but in essence, this is the color of the sky that dominates the city. And I remember my childhood very much these sort of different color smokes coming from the steel mills in Dnipropetrovsk. So it's a place which definitely could do with renovation, but it also was becoming, it was a sort of a city, almost like a country of its own, where it had its own governance, its own supply, but also elected its own governance. And the decisions were made by the workers, then put forward to the government of the mill, which was quite an interesting phenomena, given that by that point the Soviet system itself was failing, yet on the territories of this mill it somehow was functioning a lot better in that kind of workers to government process. So that was interesting in itself as well. It was incredibly challenging, but also a fascinating environment. And I went around painting in these tunnels of pipes between these. So this is just a connecting tunnel between the two factory floors. So the area where they would process the ore and then refine it. So here's a photograph from that one of those tunnels. There were multiples of these endless perspectives of pipes. And as you can see, there's literally not a single tree, but it had quite a lot of wildlife, animals and dogs living there. So here you can see where this original painting had come from. So this is the image of the painting that I worked on at Trinity. I've done endless images of those pipes. I was fascinated by the geometry, by this complexity of the pipes, and I spent hours and hours going around there. I was very fortunate. I was given a complete freedom to roam eventually. You could see there's so many details. There's a big receptacle pot into which the steel would be poured, and the flares from the gas from the refining process. I found this fascinating, the web of lines and this forest, and I think of the consistencies of colors, and that very sort of almost alien environment that you would suddenly kind of like enter into this parallel reality that's been there for nearly 100 years, accumulating layers and layers of dust and layers and layers. So, you know, I'm sure nobody wiped dust there since 1930s. There's history there. And I found it really captivating. It was probably one of the most terrifying environments as well. The heat, the temperature, the sound was overwhelming, and but also stunning. So I painted in, you can see the way that the colors are changed through this extreme heat that's emerging from the furnaces, and it was very beautiful. It was captivating. I could have spent a year painting there and probably wouldn't have been enough. But you can see the scale. Can you see this tiny little figure there? There's emerging. There's a tiny where the mouse is. There's a tiny figure on the thing. And when you see the people, you suddenly realize there's a person inside the cabin of this crane. Can you see a little orange dot? So even though this looks such a grand thing, when you see the little scale of human being in it, it suddenly takes you back. And so here's the painting that I've done. You can see the paint brushes are rushed, and I think my hands were shaking so much. And the first day where I came out, luckily there was a kiosk on the exit point just outside the exit from the factory that sold shots of vodka by a shot. And that was the first thing I did. Even though I didn't smoke and I didn't drink, I bought myself a cigarette and a shot of vodka because my legs were shaking so much. I didn't think I could make it to the tram station because it was just so traumatic. After a while, I got used to it and I didn't need a vodka anymore. But it was, yes, it was probably the most overwhelming. So standing close to a pot with over 1,000 degrees, nearly 2,000 degrees centigrade heat coming from it, it was quite something. So there's a little few snippets from the place which I thought were just really beautiful. I was able to capture people at work and grown really close with some of the teams that I've encountered day in, day out. So there's me. You can hear. This is a quiet day, in fact, on the floor. There was lots of other animals going around, so I've encountered some of the other locals as well. This is the steel rolling part of the process where the steel gets flattened out. You can see a bit of red where the steel is coming in, and then gets the leftovers get cut up. But there's just the light and the colors. I found this sort of fascinating world of its own that you've sort of entered once you walked through the doors of the mill. So this is my interpretation of the same thing, all painted from life. As you can see, here's my easel again in this little tiny control room. And as I was saying, that the thing that's starting to emerge even more poignantly for me is the people who have contributed and people who worked in those unbelievably challenging places, terrifying and scary, but who've turned up every day knowing how challenging the process is and how old the equipment is, and they've worked really hard in this environment to make something. So I've worked on the series of portraits. This one of the supervisors of the process in the steel refinery part. That's his portrait while he was overlooking the process. In the background, you can see a steel through the window. So he literally would sit there, look out of the window, and I would paint him as he would occasionally look at me. And I got a chance to talk to them. So you can see how cracked the windows are, and the little holes from the explosions that happened regularly throughout the process. When the water gets caught in the in one of the pots through the water getting into the furnaces, or some unwanted elements entering, you have occasional, absolutely deafening explosion, and the whole floor lights up with fire. And you can see how this bit of glass is the only thing that sometimes separates you from those explosions. And often you have people on the ground who, so this is a person obviously guiding the process, standing right in front of the furnaces. And that is their daily routine, that is their daily work, which is give a context to how some of those people are now at the front line. Obviously, having survived something like this is probably a more than a preparation for having to endure danger on the line. So here are some of the photographic portraits of people I've encountered that I felt are now kind of linking me in a way to what's going on in Ukraine now, because a lot of those people would be either at the front line or still sometimes some of them will still be working at the mill. So here's a few images. This is another floor supervisor for the process. Yeah, some of the workers, and kind of having that live face, having a face to put to the process, having a face to put to the story, I sort of felt very important and very poignant. So bringing me back to Ivan, this is the floor where Ivan, the person who I painted the portrait of and who's now the front line, this is the floor and the process he worked on, the initial stage of processing the raw ore into a very base metal, and the molting part. Oops, this is a bit out of line. And this story sort of taken us back to a human encounter. So again, the scale here, you can see the person at the bottom in the relation to the size of this pot in the front. You can see the person guiding the work. And I just wanted to show a few of the moments to give the context of how my perception of those people, so literally merging with the environment, merging with this mill, and how challenging the place is. And has its own beauty. So again, these people supervising the malted steel that's now coming out after being processed. And again, we're talking thousands and thousands of centigrades, literally a few meters away from you. Sure, the health and safety, it was not necessarily at all present. And these are some of the beautiful walks that I've sort of encountered through the thing, and met some of the locals. So it's become very much a home where I lived pretty much with these people for months and ate, and it's become a very, very closely connected to the place. So here's an image of Ivan at work in 2008 when I was visited there. And I found that image being very sort of classic. Somehow it sort of resonated with some of the Soviet paintings, but being in the presence of this danger and the power of this steel and molten lava has just gave that a real kind of a different spin on how heroic those people really are to endure it every day, and the kind of beauty, this odd industrial beauty of this say sort of post-apocalyptic environment. So Ivan was again supervisor is on the malting process. So he's obviously completed his degree, his university degree in metallurgy in Dnipropetrovsk, and worked in the steel mill, and then became a interior designer to pursue his second dream, his dream in his life. and was sort of happily settled with his family. He modeled for me for this image, and further this was exhibited in the Zaporizhstall Museum as the final show. When I came back to London, I wanted to use Ivan's image to take further, to work on images that again resonate somehow with artists like Velázquez, who have been sort of ever-present inspiration in my art. And there is a painting by Velázquez called Vulcan and Venus. So if you can remember from mythology, Greek mythology, Vulcan was the god of metallurgy, and he was married to the goddess of beauty, who was Venus. And Venus had an affair with Mars, which caused a rift. So Mars is a god of war. It was so present even in the time, so 2009, 2010, when there was talk about the Iraq War, this affair between the production of metal, production of raw material for the military equipment, and this love affair between this process of the beauty, the love, the fulfillment of those base desires by humanity of survival, and this affair between a relationship, a complex relationship between those elements. And revisiting this image, when I started working on the painting as a base layer, as I've mentioned, using carbon-rich paint, which is black, I introduced images of tanks produced by different countries. So the Russian, and the sort of the reference to the conflict in Israel, and American tanks were introduced throughout the entire painting. So you can see as a base layer on a larger scale, and then the close-up, these base layer drawings that got painted over with thicker and thicker consequent layers. So in an odd way, it was kind of prophetic that beyond and underneath all of these processes, the conflict is hidden. It's never went away. This threat of war has kind of been ever present since the separation, I guess, from Ukraine. So when everybody naively said, I guess, thought that we can move on and we can move forward with the building of Ukrainian nation, and everybody got on with it, I guess that wasn't, there were a lot of unresolved ends that's just come to haunt us now. And in some odd way, this painting have now turned to be a somewhat a sort of a prophecy in this process. To come back now to the present time, just wanted to, as a sort of commemorative thing, to bring it back to people who are actually now making history, making present at the front line, and who are very, very closely linked to Ukraine, to the country. And I wanted to put a face to this process that I've started long ago with working in the mills, working in this building of Ukraine as an independent country through industrial process, through working in the factories, to being now at the different front line, to defending with the arms that are very, very sometimes outdated, very rough tools to try and maintain Ukraine as a country. This is the photograph from last week in the muds and the conditions that they have to survive in. And as a sort of conclusion, this is my video from when I was in Zaporizhzhia, and I've shot it as a sort of a very cheesy thing where I thought every day when you came to the gate of the steel mill, there was music to greet the workers to enter the mill. And every day there was this big stand with all the heroes of the metallurgy from this steel mill. So what I found quite amusing and sort of slightly curious at the time have suddenly become a very, very strong point for me, thinking about what is it that the art and the message that an artist could fall back in these present times, because I find that now painting a conflict the way I used to is nearly impossible because it's so close to home. Depicting atrocities and depicting destruction have become too painful for me. So my gaze have turned back to what I worked on the most, the portraits, the people, and the presence of a human being, whether in its natural naked form or through a person and a portrait, is that affirmation of the building blocks of our society. What's going to take our country and culture forward in the end is going to be the people who inspire, the people who have been respected, put on those stands, put on the walls of Trinity Hall, on the walls of Steel Mill display, and preserving those people, preserving their legacy and preserving the positive things they've discovered, the discoveries in the science, in their shapes and forms, the discoveries in the hard work in the metallurgy. It's this contribution of pushing humanity forward that I hope can become a basis for maybe my next set of historical works that I'm hoping to work on when I can come back to finding the strengths in myself to come and deal with this subject. So I'd like to finish on that and thank you all for incredible patience. And Hisaki, very much arigatou gozaimasu for
Thank you so much, Ulyana. This was fantastic. You closed the circle between great hall in the hall in Trinity and the portraits of the creators of this steel processes at the end. That's amazing how you can combine these completely different ends of the world, parts of the world.
Thank you, Gareth. Thank you.
I have one, it's more like a comment than a question. Do you know Simon Baron Cohen?
Yes, we've met through Trinity. We haven't had a chance to be in close contact or have discussions, but we have indeed met.
The reason I mentioned him in your context here is because, I mean, a lot of your talk, of course, was directly related to the war in Ukraine. And you showed this picture from the school where you explained how the children are taught, to fight war, essentially. And you mentioned that human creativity leads to torture in the extreme. And that immediately reminded me of a book which Simon Baron Cohen wrote. Can you read? It's called 0 Degrees of Empathy. Do you know this book?
No, I'll write that down.
We also had a similar Trinity discussion with Simon Baron Cohen.
Yeah.
And this is about the same issue. It's the question, how is it possible that humans are able to do such atrocities, And so Simon Baron Cohen, he wrote this book about 0 degrees of empathy. And he's a neurologist, and at the same time also he works on many different aspects of autism. And so he has a very deep view on how human mind works. No? So he looks at exactly, I think it's the same issue as you discussed with these paintings in this section of your talk. So I had to talk about, I had to think about, I immediately associated that with Simon Baron-Cohen's work.
Yeah, it's interesting because I say autism is very much sort of a present condition, and it has sort of its positive sides, obviously a very, very powerful memory thing. But whether, yes, it's a big question whether one can suppress or bring forward this ability to suppress empathy, or where does the naturally born absence of empathy, whether it can collide or interact with a promotion of this quality in humans through conditions, through war, through obviously conditioning through drugs, which is often what happens in those conflict zones, that children are taken and then conditioned through exposure to abuse and drugs to then train into being a sort of war tools that specifically to commit those atrocities. So yes, that's
the other point. You mentioned this nuclear power station. I don't know how to pronounce it. Zaporizhstall, or this very huge.
Zaporizhstall.
How?
Zaporizhstall.
Zaporizhstall.
Yes, right. It's tricky.
And one of my friends, he's an American nuclear operator, and he was also a nuclear regulator. And when this Fukushima disaster happened, he was selected by President Obama to be the chief of a group of 130 US nuclear engineers who came for 11 months to Japan to help the Japanese government and the Japanese Prime Minister directly to cope with a nuclear disaster in Fukushima. And when this about 3 months ago, I proposed him to The Economist magazine, and he wrote an article about his perspective as a nuclear, regulator, and with a person with very deep nuclear experience, to write his opinion about what the dangers are and what should be done in mitigation. I can send you the link to the article. I think it's very interesting to get this perspective. It's not the artistic perspective, it's a nuclear engineering perspective, but it might be interesting for you.
Definitely, yes. And of course, yes, obviously Ukraine has its own sort of Chernobyl experience, and it'll be interesting to compare how that was dealt with, because there's obviously been, the world had learned a lot from the dangers based of disaster based on the Chernobyl. That would be. So yes, it is a very worrying trend of how, in fact, Larissa is probably the person with the latest detailed news on. Larissa has been following the events, and she mentioned yesterday to me that now there is nearly 70% of Ukrainian nuclear powers, so infrastructure has been shut down to preserve. I don't know, I haven't confirmed whether there is confirmation on public news on that, but there is a huge danger to obviously population to lose supply of energy, and of course that affects factories, production, personal lives, yet the danger of maintaining those power stations working under continuous bombardment for Europe and for the world is huge. They are literally sitting nuclear bombs. So that discussion where Russia is threatening to throw a nuclear bomb is not even relative, because they've already have nuclear bombs on place. They don't necessarily need to unleash one. All they need to do is to, so the the nuclear warfare have started, regardless whether they have yet to announce the use of nuclear weapons. The actual nuclear war as such have been unleashed from the moment they've introduced explosives into Zaporizhstall, introduced the bombing of those sites. And I think there's this discussion that needs to be brought forward, that waiting for the time when Russia will press the button is too late. It already is happening.
Okay, we are 4 left now. If there are any questions, please ask Larissa or Hisaki. Do you have questions? You have to unmute.
Unmute.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much indeed for such a powerful talk. It's so rich in content that it's impossible to sum it up in a few words, and thank you in a few words. And perhaps I may remind myself of the definition of imagination by Coleridge, which goes on like this: a balance or reconciliation of opposite or discordant qualities. He said this about poetry, but this applies to art in general, and your talk is an example and a best specimen of a balance or reconciliation of opposite or discordant qualities, in which the ancient and modern, destruction and creativity and all the conflicting elements unified in your artistic work. And perhaps this is too trivial to say in this way, but I thank you very much indeed. It's a wonderful talk. I'm so moved by it.
Thank you very much, Hisaki. It's a beautiful, beautiful way to sum up. It's I appreciate that. That's a beautiful comment. Thank you.
Larissa, do you have comments? Thank you very much. For me, it was very interesting too. But I haven't a little different about art. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Ulyana. So we'll stop the meeting now. And what I'll do is I have to convert this, and I'll send you an email maybe 15 minutes from now. We can do this checking if you like.
Great.
Is that okay?
Thank you so much, Garrett, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
May I add
for
one gossipy topic? I had only 1 year with Trinity as a visiting fellow commoner back in 1984 to 85, and there was one person whom you missed, and or to put it another way, he missed you. That was Tresillian Nicholas, who was 96. Gerhard remembers him very well.
I remember.
He was 96 in 1984, and he lived on till 101 years old, and the Trinity celebrated his 101 birthday, and I think he is commemorated in the chapel, and one can see it. Yeah. Sorry to draw a red herring at the very last moment.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Very much.